Thank you so much for joining us today to mark Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday and the serve-a-thon that Hunger Free America has around the country to really reclaim his legacy, not just as a leader for civil and human rights, but against poverty and hunger and against war and violence of all forms. We have an all-star panel today with Jonathan Eig, an old friend of mine and one of the greatest authors in America today of biographies. Isaac Newton Farris Jr., who's with the King Center, as well as a nephew of the late Dr. King. And first, I want to set it off with an introduction from the esteemed Deputy Secretary of Agriculture, Dr. Jewel Bronaugh. She's done it all. She has a PhD from Virginia Tech. She was the Farm Service Agency State Director for the state of Virginia. For those of you not in agriculture, that's a big deal. She was in charge of the federal programs directly aiding farmers with support programs in the state of Virginia. Then she became the Secretary of Agriculture of the state of Virginia. For those of you who don't know what a Deputy Secretary of Agriculture does, it's an unheralded position, but the Secretary goes around making lots of speeches. I know Secretary Vilsack manages well, but the Deputy Secretary helps with the budget, helps with the programming, and really keeps this massive department running. She's from Petersburg, Virginia, very famous in Civil War history, as well as home of the Slow Pitch Softball Hall of Fame, not to be confused with the other Softball Hall of Fame in Oklahoma, city. So if you ever need some Petersburg, Virginia trivia, just ask me. So I'm honored to introduce Deputy Secretary Bronaugh.
Oh, Joel, thank you so much for that introduction. One, you told me something about my hometown that I didn't know about, so I have some more bragging rights about Petersburg, Virginia, and just appreciate you talking about what a deputy secretary does, because a lot of times people are like, wonder what she does. So that was well defined. Thank you to Hunger Free America for having me today to celebrate the life and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. As we all know, Dr. King dedicated his life to serving his fellow man, which is certainly why we recognize his birthday with the Day of Service. And as I think about being here in the role as Deputy Secretary, as a Black woman, as the first Black woman Deputy Secretary in the history of USDA, I am certainly keenly aware of how my service in this role would absolutely not be possible without the efforts of Dr. King and the civil rights movement. His dedication to equity, to non-discrimination, to serving the poor is reflected in many of the programs and efforts at USDA. And for those of us who are, in many cases, first-time leaders at USDA, would not be possible without his leadership. I think about some of our programs at USDA and the impact that he has had. Our nutrition programs, including WIC, SNAP, and the National Food Lunch Program, touch millions of Americans each day. And these programs are the most far-reaching and powerful tools available to ensure that all Americans, regardless of race, ethnicity, or background, have access to healthy, affordable food. And the reach and the breadth of our nutrition programs would not have been possible without the work of Dr. King. They are proof that what he and other civil rights leaders set out to create is still working decades later. Dr. King inspires all of us to serve others. That's what he and his legacy are all about, and that's how we honor his legacy. I call on all of you to expand your involvement in your communities, as many of you all have probably already done today, and I say thank you for that. So whether you volunteer at a food bank, donate to a shelter, you help an elderly neighbor, I hope you take time today and going forward to serve your community. We all have the ability to make a difference, both large and small. The life of Dr. King certainly reminds us of all of that. So let's continue to be mindful. And thank you all so much for having me here today. And when I leave you today, I am going to volunteer and serve my community. So Joel, thanks again for all of your leadership, your great energy, and thank you for having me here today.
So now we have a meetup panel. We're going to talk for a little bit, then take some online question with Isaac Newton Farris Jr. As I said, is a senior fellow at the King Center in Atlanta. He happens to have been a nephew of Dr. King, and the great Jonathan Eig. I have to plug his new book, King, A Life. It comes out in May. I'm very honored to have had an advanced copy and to have read it. And John and I are old friends dating back to high school, but he started as a journalist with the Wall Street Journal, New Orleans Times-Picayune, lots of other publications, went on to become a biographer. You did an amazing biography of Luke Herrig, one of Muhammad Ali that many people say is one of the greatest sports biographies of all time. Wrote a book about the inventor of the reproductive bill, and less honorably Al Capone, but still a fascinating read. So this is a tremendous, panel today. And I'll start with you, Isaac. What does Dr. King's legacy on poverty and hunger issues mean to you? What comes first to your mind when you think about his role on these issues?
When you say about his role on
his role in the Poor
issues,
People's Campaign he launched.
Well, first and foremost, I think it's important. I appreciated the words that we just heard, very inspiring. But the first thought that comes to my mind, and I think the thing that he wanted to convey first and foremost was, the poverty issue just does not affect American Blacks. It's an issue that affects the country as a whole, and that's why he really was taking the steps with his Poor People's Campaign to involve the entire milieu of the American population, and so I think it's vital. Without, as long as poverty and hunger exist, we cannot truly exist and truly excel as a society. We just cannot. And so I think it's vital, like he said, it's the beginning step of creating the beloved community that he talked about. And we got a quick glimpse of the possibilities. It's unfortunate that the child tax credit payments are no longer happening in America. For the first time, we actually saw the child poverty rate decrease. And as you know, Joel and Jonathan, and to the rest of everyone else who's with us today, our children are our future. And if we're not properly taking care of them, we have no future.
Thank you. One of the things all of John's books do, all of his biographies do, is take icons and shows that they're also human beings, flesh and blood human beings. And sort of the stereotype of King, and in this great book he dispels it, is that he had these flashpoints and all of a sudden became someone different. All of a sudden in the late 60s he discovered poverty and then focused on it. But as your book shows, he was concerned about that throughout his career, dating back to a very young child, seeing bread lines in the Depression in the Atlanta area. So can you talk just a little, John, about his evolution on his thinking about poverty, how he saw it as inseparable from the civil rights issue, and how he developed over time on those issues and hunger?
Yeah, that's a great question, Joel. And as Isaac knows better than almost anyone, this was deeply rooted in King's family history. We think about him turning toward poverty, turning toward issues of hunger when he launched the Poor People's Campaign in 1968, just shortly before his assassination. But King was talking about poverty and hunger his entire life. And as you pointed out, he saw bread lines during the Great Depression. He was born in 1929. His father was the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, where when people were struggling through the Depression, the church took care of them. The church made sure that they hired people from the church to do work within the community, that there was daycare, that there was a food pantry for people at Ebenezer. So King grew up in that environment. And when you think about even his most iconic work and his most iconic words, it's all tied into those themes of providing for society, providing for our neighbors. I mean, it comes straight out of the Bible, and you know, he was quoting the Bible before he could read. But Montgomery bus boycott, who were those people marching in Montgomery? They were housekeepers who were struggling to get to work, having to walk miles to take care of white families, and then walking home at night. So King and the other organizers made sure they had transportation and cooked for them, because they knew they wouldn't have time to cook when they got home from work because the buses weren't running. This was at the core of everything he did.
One of the reasons we do this is, every year is, yes, to get service performed around the country, but really to explain the full, true legacy of Dr. King. His legacy every year, as both of you know very well, is whitewashed, and that is my pun intended. Some people today willfully misuse his quotes to falsely claim he was against affirmative action, to falsely claim he was a small government conservative, when the reverse is true. And when they do focus on accurate parts of his legacy, it's only the civil rights legacy. The fact that he had three pillars of his philosophy of ending hatred and class and racial distinctions, number one, but number two, entirely ending poverty and hunger, and number three, entirely ending violence and war. That's a very radical idea. And if you talk a little about the Poor People's Campaign that he launched, and then also a little about the role of Coretta Scott King in continuing that after he was assassinated, along with the great Ralph Abernathy, his really partner in the Southern Leadership Christian Council. Can you talk a little about how that started and how what it did after he was assassinated? So, Isaac.
Yes, well, first off, the Poor People's Campaign, I've always felt, ironically, is what really got my uncle assassinated. Because if we really look at what he was attempting to do and what he was going to do, this was not going to be like the March on Washington, where hundreds of thousands of people gathered for one day of speeches and then returned to their communities. Much like what the World War I veterans did, he was coming and they were going to establish a city in Washington, D.C. And they were going to stay there until the president and the Congress addressed the issues of poverty. And I think that really frightened I know that frightened the powers to be, because on one front, they were dealing with America's youth that were called hippies at the time, and their fight against the war in Vietnam. And then here, Uncle Emil, as I refer to him, Uncle Emil's coming into town, bringing everybody, from Hispanics to Appalachian whites to blacks to Jews to probably would have been at that time, I think most people, when they thought of Muslims, they thought of the Nation of Islam, which was kind of a cult of Islam. But I'm sure Malcolm, the post the Malcolm that had been to Mecca, post Mecca, would have joined him and brought Muslims of like kind, and it really was a frightening thing. And one of the things that they were going to do, for instance, we just had the Deputy Secretary of the USDA. They were going to do things like, go to the USDA the administration building, hold little mini demonstrations there. The next day they might go to the FBI, go to the transportation building. I mean, really we're going to engage in nonviolent, because keep in mind, unlike demonstrations we see today, that there was never an instance of any destruction of property or persons in any march that my uncle led, of the many marches that he did. Memphis, he did not. And the staff tried to keep him from going there for that reason. Doc, this is not a march we're organizing. You don't know what will happen. But they were going to come to DC, and they were going to massively, nonviolent, but aggressively demonstrate. And I think that really frightened the powers that be, but it's unfortunate that it did not happen, because I do think that maybe they could have really forced some changes in policies.
First, King had to deal with the very basic issue that Black people weren't being treated even remotely as full citizens in this country. But all along, when he was fighting for the Voting Rights Act and for the Civil Rights Act, these Bible-based beliefs that all men are equal, that poverty is wrong, that militarism is wrong, they were there all along. And by the time he's ready to start talking about these things in the mid-60s, more openly, he's getting a lot of pushback, even from within his own organization. And by the time he's pushing for Resurrection City, and I should say, Coretta has got his back. Coretta has had his back all along. Coretta was an activist before Martin Luther King Jr. was an activist. She is gung-ho for this, but even King's supporters are warning him, you're going to destroy everything you've built. There's this painful conversation, and we can hear the words because the FBI was bugging the phones. The FBI was trying, as Isaac said, to destroy him. And we hear him on the phone with one of his top advisors and closest friends saying, don't you understand me? I've been saying this all along. How can you tell me not to stick my neck out? How can you tell me not to speak up for the poor and for the hungry, for those people in Vietnam? I've been saying all along what I believe. Were you not listening? And it's just so heartbreaking to hear that even the people who love him have to be convinced that this is what he truly believes.
Yes.
And let me just say, in my view, having studied this, is that the Resurrection City and the Poor People's Campaign was actually more successful than contemporaries viewed it, because look, as we know, Coretta carried it on for a while. She went to Resurrection City, as you reported, and she said a phrase that's just still seared in my mind. Poverty is violence. She said, poverty is violence. I can't see a way of making that connection more deeply. And Dr. Abernathy carried it on. And they did get an awful lot of media attention. And it had very significant concrete impact. Richard Nixon ran for president in 1968 denying that hunger was a problem in America. And by the next year, he had the first White House conference on hunger. We haven't had a second one until literally 2022. And the Nixon Conference on Hunger wasn't just right-wing window dressing. He created the Women's, Infants, and Children program, the forerunner of it, by executive order. He laid the predicate for the creation of the modern food stamp program, which then Bob Dole, another right-wing Republican, worked with George McGovern, a liberal Democrat, to get that passed. And so I would argue that the Poor People's Campaign actually forced the federal government to do something serious about hunger. And those improvements in the anti-hunger programs by the mid-1970s had almost entirely ended hunger in America. They almost entirely ended hunger in America. We know because teams of doctors went to many of the places that had the highest levels of hunger, places like inner cities in Harlem and South Central LA and the South Side or West Side of Chicago and Appalachia and Native American, reservation, other parts of Indian country, the Texas-Mexico border. And they went back a decade later and found out there had been a very significant reduction in hunger, even though there was still poverty. So I think, yes, we can speculate what would have happened even more had Dr. King lived, but even the movement he started and didn't quite get to finish had very significant impacts. I want to talk about the radicalism of nonviolence. I read so often now, oh, he started as nonviolent and then became a radical. And the implication that the people spouting violence were the real radicals. I reject that. First of all, radical means something different, a fundamental shift. people have used violence to try to resolve disputes for the few million years since humans started walking erect. There's nothing radical about the failures of violence. Nonviolence, and not passive nonviolence, but he and Gandhi did active nonviolence, using it as an aggressive tool of social justice, I would argue was far more radical and also far more effective than the use of violence. Isaac, do you agree with that?
Oh, no, no question about it. He was confronted with it, especially, ironically, after 64 and 65, which really unlocked the chains that had been holding people of color back. And I'm referring to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. But after that, ironically, he was confronted with, you're weak and Malcolm strong. And this is the Malcolm, pre-Mecca Malcolm I'm referring to. If you were really strong and if you really want to show strength, you've got to fight back. And all he was saying is, hey, I agree with you. Let's fight back, but let's fight back non-violently. And it's much more radical to see somebody, put their minds and their bodies on the line for a cause that they believe in, while not inflicting physical violence or verbal violence. Not only was there not 1 inch of property destruction and no bodies killed or injured, but you can come to my uncle's demonstrations and see signs like "Go to hell, Ku Klux Klan," "Death to George Wallace." you wouldn't see that because here again he recognized, and I think you mentioned this earlier, Joel, that violence is just not confined to acts of physicality. I mean, there's violence in some of our policies of this nation. There's violence in some of the words that are used. So clearly, and Jonathan, you might want to add. I get a little wordy, Joel. Sorry about that.
No need to about this. Is great, John.
You summed it up great, Isaac. And I would just add that we forget sometimes that King was a person with feelings, and here he is over and over saying nonviolence is not weak. Nonviolence takes greater strength than threatening people, than attacking people. And here he is taking it on all sides. The FBI is after him. The federal government's giving him a hard time. The segregationists in the South want him dead. He's been stabbed. His house has been bombed. And then you've got the more radical, so-called more radical Black activists like Malcolm and Stokely Carmichael accusing him of being soft. And he's not understood. He doesn't understand why people are turning on him when he's been at the forefront. Stokely and Malcolm were great, but what laws did they get passed? What were they able to fight the White House for? Dr. King notched some of the greatest accomplishments of any person outside the power structure that I think our country's ever seen. That's not weakness that got that done.
This is, I think, a good place to close out. Let me say my favorite Dr. King quote is, "What much does it profit a man to be able to eat at an integrated lunch counter if he can't afford a hamburger? What much does it profit a man to be able to eat at an integrated lunch counter if he can't afford a hamburger?" The March on Washington was the march for jobs and justice. This idea that Johnny come lately on this was a co-equal part of the movement. And the first freedom really is the ability to eat. And there is an endless discussion among activists and politicians. Well, is it receptive politicians who make this happen? Or is it social movements who force them to make this happen? And I personally think the lesson of Dr. King is that you need both. That Dr. King could have had the movement, but if Bull Connor instead of Lyndon Johnson was president of the United States, it wouldn't have happened. On the other hand, Lyndon Johnson could have been president, but if there wasn't this movement pressuring him, he wouldn't have gotten any of that, progress. So I think it's missing the boat that we really need both. We need to elect elected officials who are responsive to these issues, who have, generally values that care about these issues and are amenable to being influenced. And then we need to fight like hell to push them. I always say my job as an activist is to get elected officials to do something more than they would have done had I not existed, but probably not so much that if they did it, they'd lose their job. Meaning that if we haven't prepared the country well enough for our message, then we're not doing our job. I'll ask John and then Isaac to have the closing words on that. John?
Well, I just want to say that it's been great talking to you, and I learn something every time I'm with both you, Joel, and with you, Isaac. And I'll close with just one thought. You know, you asked earlier what Dr. King would think about conditions today, and Isaac answered that beautifully. I would just say that I know what he would do, and that's that he'd still be out there marching and still be out there pushing for change to make America more true to its stated ideals.
Isaac?
I would just add to what you were saying, Joe, it's a daily mantra with me as a part of most presentations that I give. At some point, I'm always saying to people, the time is over for voting for people that look like you do. The time now is to vote for people that think like you do. Okay? And you can find people that think like you do across the entire spectrum: Democrat, Republican, Independent, Green Party. So we need to get away from these artificial walls of separation and stereotyping, and really, support the people who do believe, who think like Dr. King thought. That's the bottom line. And you can find that's just not Black people. That's just not Christian people. That's people who live by the code that we're all God's children. And so therefore we're responsible to one another and responsible for one another.
Well, on that note, thank you, Isaac. Thank you, John. Again, King Life, you can now pre-order it in your better independent bookstores and on your large corporate, which also promoted my book. So thank you, John. Thank you, Isaac. And thank you all for tuning in. Now let's go out and make this dream a reality. Let's not rest until we have racial justice, nonviolence, and no poverty. That's simple. Go out and do it. Thank you all.
Thank you, Joel.
Thank you.